Welcome to Burning Platforms, a podcast from the Australia Institute's Centre for Responsible Technology, decoding the politics of technology from around the world. I'm Peter Lewis, the director of the centre. This week we dive deep into efforts to track flows of misinformation with Dan Angus from QUT's Digital Media Research Centre. But first, our wrap of the latest tech news with Digital Rights Watch Chair Lizzie O'Shea and Josh Taylor from Guardian Australia.
It feels though this week there's only really one issue, and we'll probably just be attacking that from a bunch of different angles, and that's the tragic invasion of Ukraine that's being played out over the last week. I'm conscious that war is such an exploitative medium that it's not about jumping on the back of war to talk about our tech hobby horses. It's actually about looking at what's a hugely dangerous, disruptive event to try to understand the world that we're creating. And it's great to have Josh in the room, who's been writing for Guardian Global about some of those different storylines that are playing out and different ways the technology is being used. But I think in the first half hour, it's going to be great to sort of look at both what's happening internationally, what's happening with the platforms, what's happening in Australian politics, and broader thinking about what this means for the long-term, structure of the global World Wide Web, as we used to call it. And then in the second half, we're going to dive deep with Dan, who's part of an amazing team at QUT, who, I don't know the best way to describe your work, but it feels to me like you're almost forensic digital DNA testers, so that you go deep into the way information flows to work out who done it. It's not always, sometimes there's an undone it, but it's really interesting work, Dan. So we're looking forward to that. There's a paper that we've been working on with you over the last few weeks that we'll be talking about a bit later. We'll try to convince Josh that there is actually a yarn in there, although his news desk did come back saying, well, you're saying nothing's happening, so it's not a story, which is the way news works. But we can get there in the second half. But Dan, you're really welcome to join us in this first half of the session as well. So let's kick off, Josh, with what's happening in the Ukraine. Your missive through The Guardian was really interesting, that it was looking at both the way that information and access to information was being used effectively as another theatre of war. And I'm interested if you want to sort of just take us through some of your impressions, and then we can sort of kick around.
Yeah, so I think there's this whole sort of notion with the internet that it's, not the real world. But I think that is fastly being sort of, dissipating. People don't sort of really believe it anymore because, if there's a war now on, there will also be a war online, particularly with Russia having such a, large cyber capability. We know they're behind a lot of cyber attacks already. So it was obvious that it was going to have a huge online component at least. And so I've been sort of taking a little bit of a helicopter view in the past week, just sort of seeing all the different, I'm reluctant to call them like war fronts, but that's kind of what it is online. I think there was some research, Checkpoint put out some research this week that suggested that in the first days of combat, cyber attacks on the Ukraine government and military websites went up about 196% compared to the rest of February. But the interesting part, I think, has been similar to what we're seeing on the ground in the Ukraine, is that this fight back, not just from the government itself, but from ordinary citizens. You've got anonymous jumping in, doing cyber attacks, people taking down Russian media websites. The Ukrainian government's actually organizing, cyber activity on Telegram, which is maybe a little bit questionable given who is behind Telegram. But they've got a Telegram channel that's got 175,000 people. They're doing stuff like DDoS attacks on Russian websites. There was also the interesting thing where a ransomware group, Conti, had their internal communications leaked by a pro-Ukrainian member of that group because they were angry that Conti had sided with Russia. So I thought that was probably the interesting sort of cyber things. I think there's still quite a bit going on there. We'll probably discuss what the social media companies and the tech companies are doing in a little bit of time. But I thought it was interesting that both Facebook and Twitter came out this week basically saying that they'd removed a couple of pro-Russian influence operations that had not been all that successful, but it sort of made them seem like they were doing things and responding to it. We can discuss that a little bit later. I think the crypto aspect to all of this is quite interesting as well. So the Ukrainian government has been asking for people to make donations to fund the war effort. Something like, I think $18 million flooded into the country in the first few days. And there was an interesting story today about they were planning on doing an airdrop NFT type thing, which was basically like they would give you a token if you're donating to the arms effort or whatever. And a lot of money flooded into that, as tend to happen with these NFT crypto type things. And then the government announced today that they're effectively what is known in the crypto community is like rug pulling, where they're not going to do this airdrop anymore, where they're giving people something for donating, but they're going to instead launch their own sort of NFT type things where people can get some sort of NFT for donating money to the war effort. So there's a fair bit going on there.
There's a lot of moving parts. Yeah, there's kind of the structure of how the different warring parties are having access to the tools of technology. Then there's using wild and wonderful new technology, including, I might add, Elon Musk being drawn into the conflict over Twitter by the Ukrainian government to support Ukrainians bypassing the blockages that the Russians had put up by accessing his space satellite, which just, there are so many layers. That's not a science fiction movie. That's happening.
Yeah, I was surprised that happened so quick. Well, I mean, it is Elon Musk, so he does often insert himself into these global situations. Although in this case, I think it was the Ukrainian Vice President Fedorov who put the call out and asked for it, but he got it there quite quickly and was able to have internet access delivered by the Starlink satellites into Ukraine quite quickly. And it's interesting to see. There was some speculation I saw online that this is potentially an issue, though, because satellite communication tools can be tracked and used to track people, so it might not be all that great in the long term. But yeah, it's interesting to see sort of how the world is responding in different ways, and particularly online.
Lizzie, there's so much to sort of bounce off here. What's been your perception from a distance?
Yeah, well, there is a lot to unpack, and sort of want to do it in an orderly fashion. But I guess starting with where you started, Josh, looking at the different capacities that exist in tech spaces and in the tech industry, I think Microsoft is an interesting example, particularly with countering cyber attacks. I mean, it's true that Russia is known for engaging in various cyber attacks. There's responsibility attributed to them for the SolarWinds attack, which saw them get access to network management systems in the United States government, be able to infiltrate that. So tech is a big part of, at least not officially, their engagement in the international sphere and a source of power for them. But I do wonder whether there's an argument to be made looking at how Microsoft was chipping into the war effort, is I suppose how you describe it, or perhaps more cynically, certainly being commandeered by the US in the war effort to resist cyber attacks directed at the Ukraine, whether we're seeing a situation where the nation state that wields the greatest technological power will ultimately potentially be more successful or have a competitive advantage against their enemies in a warfare context, given how central some of these communication systems are, not just for civilian life, but obviously also for military initiatives. What's your take, Josh, on how Microsoft was engaged in that? Because, I mean, there's a lot of cheerleading now for the Ukrainians, which I completely understand. I mean, they're being invaded by Russia, but you do wonder whether this may be deployed in other instances, in other warfare situations where Microsoft is put to task by the US government, or does it itself off its own bat, and whether this is now the kind of assets that give rise to military victory, having these tech companies who manage this kind of infrastructure and can counter these cyber attacks. What's your take on Microsoft, Josh?
Yeah, I think it is something that I know we kind of this tech notion that's kind of been in existence for everywhere, that it is kind of their argument about being a platform as well. In a lot of ways, they're neutral. They don't participate in anything. They don't have a stand on anything like that. But we're kind of more and more expecting them to do this kind of thing. And I think that it's one of those things where you don't want to establish the precedent, which is what is happening here, and it can be used in a bad way in the future. But it's one that it's so complicated. It's just one of those things where it's like, I can understand why everyone can see this as a good thing, but in the long run, it may not actually be. It's a similar sort of thing with in terms of what Google and Apple are doing, and a lot of the other companies. I remember there was it's similar to a bit what when I think there was a story a few years ago about basically getting Cloudflare and things to stop providing services to sites that were hosting sort of like the Christchurch terrorist thing, and everyone thought that was quite a good thing to do, and like no one wants those sites on the internet and things like that. But Cloudflare were quite reluctant to initially, because they're like, if we establish this precedent where we're doing this, what are we going to actually be doing in the future? Is it going to be used on something that we don't want to use? So that's one of the interesting things. Actually, that sort of feeds into the discussion around the cryptocurrency exchanges as well, because they've been quite reluctant to ban Russian addresses from being able to receive or exchange cryptocurrency on their services, because they're saying that goes against the fundamental ideas of sort of like this decentralized currency and everything like that. If we're banning Russian addresses, then what's next? What are we going to be doing next? So I don't particularly agree with him in that instance, but it's one of those things where it's like, well, how do you actually make the judgment call on that if you're being asked to do one thing, and then what's the next stage of that?
It's really interesting if you look back to 9/11 and the terrorism wars, the entire technological response at that point kind of led to the business model that is now running at least Western technology, and then starting to think through. So the starting point of this incursion, what's going to flow forward. Luckily, we've got a bunch of academics trying to think that through, but it's going to be an experiment in real life.
What extent are the companies already? Can I ask them? To what extent do we think companies are potentially already doing this anyway? And this is really just allowing it to come to the fore.
So they're deploying existing capability rather than building new models.
Exactly. I mean, we've talked about on previous episodes of this show how regulating tech for good, or civic tech, some civic tech organizations who talk about regulation deliberately pitch American technology as against Russian and Chinese technology as a source of soft power for the US government. And I'm not trying to be cynical, because I do think tech companies could do more. And then the question is what, and there's different layers of that they can be involved in doing more, so to speak. But I do think there is a question around whether what we're just seeing is perhaps the manifestation in public of things that they already do behind the scenes, and is part of a strategy for the US as much as it is for Russia. And sometimes I do feel that we often see China and Russia as being companies that use state-sponsored hacking and the like for nefarious purposes. And that does occasionally limit our capacity to see how Western governments do the same thing. And this can come to the fore in terms of precedent, as you argued, Josh, but also perhaps revealing how these dynamics are at play in non-warfare periods. And that's important to keep in mind, I think.
At least in the academic community, there are tensions at the moment, even around the involvement of tech companies within academia. So you look at a lot of academic conferences where tech companies are kind of there, they're very present, they're sending their own engineers and scientists along, submitting papers and such. But there's a tension there because the research community operates in a very open way, right? All of our research is generally published in very public ways. And they're very selective about the kinds of research they allow out into public for scrutiny. You think about what's happened with Google and Timnit Gebru, who left the ethics kind of division of Google in quite a extreme circumstance, right? She was fired essentially for her outspoken views around some of the work that Google was doing. I think you're absolutely right, Lizzie, that there's soft power here at play, even outside of a situation of war, where these tech companies are very canny around their public perception, the ways that they can kind of keep tabs even then on the research that's occurring within the scientific community and steer that in particular ways. And look, I've seen it get pretty ugly at conferences, even with like tensions between academics who, hi Josh's cat, tensions between the kind of academics like us who are very much, we're at universities and such, and we're not affiliated with these companies, and those who might have a co-affiliation between, say, a Facebook and a university. It can get pretty heated because they just don't see themselves as conflicted. But of course they are, right? They're answerable to those companies in some way.
The other area that I wanted to take this conversation was probably the level of the actual information war and the way that the propaganda is being played out as almost a reflection of different models of tech. We've seen Putin using effectively state-controlled search and state-controlled social media to really seed and propagate a narrative of the Nazification or the denazification of Ukraine. On the other side, we've got the TikTok president, former comedian, great at doing social media on the ground, who's really using that immediacy and being in the heat of battle to build and solidify support across the West. And then we've got probably another layer as well, which is the calls to ban Russia Today, and Foxtel and SBS have sort of taken Russia Today off. I saw my good friend Marcus Strom, the former federal president of MIA, just saying, is that actually the way that you, is blocking their propaganda the way that we think through our response to the issue, is understanding what Russians are hearing, part of what we should as engaged citizens be aware of. There was a push from Morrison to call on local platforms to block out all the Russia Today. It looks like now Russia Today is going to fall over because of the Western sanctions anyway. So it might be, it might be a hypothetical call anyway. But what are we learning from all this? It seems that both sides are using their models of social media as tools, and we'd be naive to think that, this is all neutral. War is about the propaganda war as well. And is it in our national interest to only get the propaganda from one side, or does that just close down the debates? I know you're a rights-based person, Lizzie. I'm interested in what you think from those ruminations.
I find this very interesting. So Senator Warner in the United States has written to all the major tech companies saying you shouldn't be allowing disinformation, which we're going to talk about in a bit. But there's a lot of discussion around not permitting monetization of this kind of content from state-sponsored news channels to continue, whether it's on YouTube or Facebook and the like. I mean, I think the claim around monetization is perhaps a little spurious in that it's designed to avoid this state propaganda reaching a wide audience rather than allowing a company to profit from it. But what I find, that may be a legitimate call in some ways, but I do think there's a very decent counter argument that, that we don't want to have news content constantly being taken down by social media platforms. And in fact, we argued this very thing in Australia 12 months ago. But I think some of this stuff becomes very much a slippery slope, and we've seen this on display. I think it's really telling that now that Netflix has cancelled all projects in Russia. They're not progressing any of them. So there's not even just a call on distribution of news, but also distribution of cultural content, that this idea that we should boycott Russia because they've invaded Ukraine now applies to tech as an industry where there's a concentration and centralization of distribution of material online. Now that call is not just about state-sponsored propaganda, but also about cultural content. And to my mind, this seems pretty serious. I saw the other day as well that some academic platform was stopping translating their articles into Russian as part of a boycott. The meerkat from that stupid television campaign has been cancelled because he's got a Russian accent. I think this is astonishing, really. And tech companies, I think there's this perception that they've had too long so much power wielded by being these choke points for content, that this is the time at which they need to step up and do the right thing. But there is a very broad argument that comes out of that, which starts to become pretty illogical pretty quickly, not least because I'm not convinced actually that there's always this huge swathes of the vast majority of Russians necessarily agree with Putin, but of course they're all being put in the same bucket and being treated the same.
Can I just throw one more in, Lizzie? There's this Australian YouTuber, Aussie Cossack, who Four Corners did a piece on a year or two ago, who's quite active around this. There was also the guy on Q&A last night that was told to leave the room. Is that the approach? I know this isn't so much a tech, but more a sort of information information hygiene, but it does feel that we're falling into various traps, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think so. History is written by the victors. And, you know, it's not that long ago that an SBS journalist essentially lost his job for a bunch of tweets about what happened, what the Australians did during the Second World War to Japanese women. Like, you know, he was talking about well-documented allegations of war crimes against Australian soldiers and lost his job because of it. I think these things are connected. I think that we do see this being the first draft of history in terms of generating propaganda. So we do need to think about not just how those terrible enemies do this, but how we do it ourselves so that we can have a proper accounting for it. I mean, I'm pretty committed to being anti-war. So
hey, Josh, how do you see the Guardian or the broader media in Australia playing this at the moment?
I mean, we're sort of leaning very heavily on our international reporters and the people who are actually on the ground in the Ukraine and things like that. In terms of the sort of local perspective, I don't know. I don't think we've done any particular sort of pro-Russian coverage or anything like that. We haven't sort of sought that out. But I haven't, to be honest, I haven't like read everything that we've written about it. Then there's been quite a lot written over the past couple of weeks. I think it's kind of interesting though, for just to sort of get back onto the social media side of things, is that I think during the pandemic there became from basically 2016 up until the pandemic and continued on, there's become this greater expectation on platforms and tech companies and things like that to take a responsibility for misinformation and disinformation on their platform. And there were, you know, people, you know, slippery slope is the cliche and everything like that, and a lot of the anti-vaxxers and people who have been banned from platforms like Craig Kelly and people like that warn that, you know, if this is how it's all going to go, then, you know, people will be taken off for other things. And I think what we're seeing in terms of banning some of these channels is sort of a similar sort of next down the line response. They're wanting people to actually just ban these stuff outright without even thinking too much about it. I think there has been a lot of misinformation being floating around online in regards to Russia and Ukraine, but you know, I don't think we've sort of settled on what we're willing to accept as part of the discourse and what is just out of bounds essentially at the moment. I don't think we've sort of come to a complete view on it yet. It's still too early days, I think.
If only we had someone that researched information flows in the room. Oh, Dan. What sort of questions are you asking yourself as this plays out? And it's a good way to sort of bring in some of the work you do into the discussion now.
Yeah, what's really interesting here for us is the kind of domestic versus that international disinformation aspect as well. And looking at, I mean, I kind of agree with Lizzie's point here around, I think it's a very blunt instrument to try and just ban like RT off the platform altogether, and then not critically examine the role of other domestic media that is also, you know, in the room spreading, you know, false narratives and you know, you just look at any issue we've had to contend with, climate change, this, that, and the other. We've had long-running domestic disinformation campaigns here in Australia that we've done very little about. And so I think, yeah, it's a complex problem, but we're mostly interested in looking at particularly coordinated and authentic activities on platforms like Twitter or Facebook and others. And these are the kind of long-running campaigns with very much where you have the involvement of actors, accounts that try to pass themselves off as genuine kind of citizenry and users of those platforms. And that's a particularly insidious form of misinformation. So I guess, you know, when you're looking at RT, you kind of know what you're getting. When you're looking at Fox News, you kind of know what you're getting. It's very easy to kind of spot and kind of, you know, wrap around a particular lens and say, look, when you're looking at that, just, you know, take it with a grain of salt, right? Be cautious with that as a product. And then you can also track how it flows, right? So it's actually very easy for us to track and trace the flows of that information. In fact, one of our researchers, you know, it looks at RT specifically and tracks it around the web. But what's really difficult and much more problematic are those kinds of astroturfing campaigns where you've got people who are trying to pass themselves off as authentic, engaged citizenry who are then kind of seeding messages within that messy online public sphere. And that's the stuff that I and the researchers in DMRC get really concerned about, because they're the ones that can have that kind of psychological effect of like, oh, look at all these other people who kind of think like me and I'm part of this group. or in actual fact, they're being duped by some kind of Russian troll farm or whatever who's got all these accounts and are sending them out there. So I think, yeah, my short version is you're looking in the wrong area if you're only looking at the large, very well-known disinformation actors and ignoring the greater kind of iceberg under there of these kinds of astroturfing campaigns.
So do you want to tell us a bit about how you go looking for icebergs and understanding icebergs? Because it's as much a data job as, an information job, isn't it?
I call it almost art sometimes as well in what we do. So look, I mean, this is with researchers who should have been here, Tim Graham, who couldn't be because his poor little boy's got COVID. But Tim and myself and Axel Bruns and others, what we do is we kind of start at entry points. So where we might have intelligence around a number of accounts that have been engaging in some kind of suspicious activity, or it could even be a series of websites we know are kind of suspicious websites that, are known kind of distributors of problematic information. And from there, there's a series of tools we've built. So Twitter provide an API, which is a way in which we can gain access into the huge volume of Twitter data that is there and circulating online. Facebook provide access to a tool that is being degraded. We can go there in a sec if you like, called CrowdTangle. So this provides some access into some Facebook data, but not all of it. So we get public posts and public posts on pages and groups, but we don't get private information and we don't get the comments. So, it gives us some information to go on. But we kind of start by looking at, the sharing of those links and then also the interactions between those communities. And that's a real tell sometimes. So Tim's done a lot of work and is continuing this work in looking at where you get artificial boosting of content. So say you've got one account that posts a link or a comment to, say it's pro-Putin, and then you get a series of other accounts that very, very quickly retweet and amplify that activity. And say you see that again and again and again. So that same pattern of boosting, and then you actually start to see patterns where the same accounts are kind of boosting each other a little bit as well. These create these networks, and those are the networks that we're really interested in looking at, because then once you spread out from them, you can get a sense of, well, who are the accounts that are involved? What is the information that they're looking to share and spread? And then how are they impacting the rest of that network around it? And really that's it. It's that kind of forensic of kind of just finding a starting point and then kind of spreading out from there to start to look at that network and where it kind of ends up. And often it is just that. It's sniffing around, following those little links to figure out if there's other bigger parts of that network that you might be able to discover. So just one example, Tim was looking at the US presidential elections a few years ago and discovered these massive coordinated networks of people promoting very much pro-Trump discourse at the time. And we found for years, Twitter didn't ban these. The evidence was clear that they were very much artificially boosting. And this is often it's semi-automated. So you might have a human behind the account, but they're using automation software to assist in that boosting of content. Because look, once you get a certain critical mass of content on platforms like Twitter, it kind of goes up in terms of its visibility on the platform and drives that, further engagement. So that kind of, when we talk about going viral, that's that process. They're trying to break into that to get those messages up there trending at the top. And there was a huge number of accounts that stayed live on the platform for years beyond that 2016 debate. And, when we go back and check on those, many are still active today. But, you can see from the evidence we have, we're very implicated in some, very, very bad kind of information coordination activity.
Daniel, can I ask a question? Where is this happening in your view? Because the common example raised in this field is Burma, where the military engaged in a pretty concerted campaign that people now argue that Facebook is responsible to some degree for the genocide that occurred there. And I do wonder whether we sort of think of it as a problem that occurs in other places. I mean, there's maybe good reasons for that because, Facebook maybe devotes less resources to content moderation in languages other than English, or certainly languages spoken by fewer people. But is this a problem that you see in places like the US, or is it largely in places that are subject to less content moderation, or is it everywhere? Is there any geographic trends?
It's everywhere, and I'm glad you bring up the example of Burma. We're doing a study on that right now. So with colleagues here in DMRC, Bondi K and Zin, who themselves are from Burma, and we've been tracking that largely through Facebook. You're right there on one key point. The language is really interesting. When you take the example of Burma, there are issues there around even just the kinds of characters that are being used so there's I won't go right into it, we don't have the time today, but there's multiple different competing formats for the TypeScript that is being used for people to communicate, but there's huge problems with in there misinformation being spread on that platform, but also, the bans and the censorship and such going on kind of in real time. So, this is a problem that exists everywhere. We have domestic disinformation here in Australia. And, we've got this report, which we'll get to, around, whether China is perhaps involved in, information warfare campaigns in Australia. The evidence we have suggests no, or not as widespread as we might think. We just don't see evidence in where we've been looking for huge kind of state-backed disinformation campaigns in Australia. But certainly there are these little pockets, these little hotspots where you do see some activity. And I worry sometimes that we can study the stuff that we can see publicly, so the public Twitter commentary, the public Facebook pages and groups. What we often don't get access into from an academic perspective, due to technical restrictions, sometimes ethics as well prevents us from going there, are the private spaces. So the private chats, message boards and threads, where that, I fear, is sometimes where those information operations are now operating more and more, and where you're getting some of that malicious activity, be it around COVID misinfo, war-related topics, or anything else for that matter.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that as well, because my view is that I think that misinformation, disinformation is largely decentralized now, because we think that it's, we see the stuff that's on Twitter and Facebook to a degree, but a lot of the stuff that we're not seeing is stuff that's being shared in WhatsApp groups. Telegram we can see to a degree. Even train emails are still a thing, stuff like that. So are you sort of able to sort of gauge and track where some of this misinformation comes from when it comes out on one of the platforms we can actually see?
Yeah, so it takes a lot more time to do it, Josh. And sometimes we're limited in the resources we have to do it. But you're absolutely right. And we've done some work to try and track that. So going as far as finding, say, on a site like 4chan, the emergence of particular mimetic communication, and then seeing how that then, where it intrudes into other platforms. So that cross-platform work is really, really important. So one of my colleagues, Ariadna Matamoros Fernandez, is looking at a lot of cross-platform work across YouTube and other platforms, and seeing where you get that kind of movement. And it's where they move from platform to platform that I sometimes think that's where you can pick it up, because they're always going to leave those breadcrumbs that from a forensic perspective you can find. So, that's how we've been finding these large kind of coordinated Facebook ecosystems of pages linking to other pages linking out to these kinds of fake news websites and such that exist outside. Those URLs give us a way to locate where that information is kind of crossing from platform to platform. But it's really interesting watching how a small community work together to craft messages, and then they kind of mature them to a point where they then break them out onto those much more public spaces like Facebook and other. And they're kind of almost using the Telegrams and Discords and other platforms to strategize about how they're going to use Facebook and the much more public platforms to stage their kind of recruitments or such. We've seen that with some of these anti-COVID kind of protests and such, that the movement from those much more private spaces into those large public to try and get their message out and co-opt, larger groups.
Christian makes the really good point that it's also different languages on different platforms, and the need, if you're going to understand this, it is a multilingual exercise. There's also, I think, a language challenge in just naming misinformation, disinformation, malinformation, and going one level down. And what I thought was really interesting with the China paper, which we're still trying to convince Josh is worth a yarn in The Guardian, is that it's actually finding that when you go looking for something you think's there that it's not there, what does that tell you? And you can explain it in more detail, but basically the assumption I think that's been brewing in Australia is that there is orchestrated activity by either Chinese military, government, or individual wolves to create discord in the Australian community, and particularly within China's Australian community. And you guys went looking at some particularly flammable issues, looking for that sort of orchestration, and it just didn't seem to be there. So what do we do with that information? Because it is a bit counter-narrative, isn't it?
It is, and I worry sometimes, like whenever we see this kind of xenophobia, rhetoric, rising, and it always seems to be near an election where we always see that dead cat bounce, right? That racism seems to rear its ugly head in Australia. I mean, in my lifetime, that goes back to the Tampa incident and even others as well. And that, at the moment, the kind of discourse that's happening around, Chinese-Australian relationships is very counterproductive and really dangerous, to be honest, as well. So yeah, we went hunting for this to see is there any evidence we could find, at least in public, on public Twitter, around Chinese coordinated activity to try and boost particular, say, pro-nationalistic framings or try and really just antagonize situations with relation to Chinese Australian discourse. And yeah, found very little. And it's really hard. And I must say, a massive caveat with these studies is we have access to what anyone on this chat can see, right? We only get what is there on Twitter. We don't see the information behind the scenes of the personal, names, phone numbers, and all of that, which one would need to really unequivocally try and make a statement around whether these are, foreign or state actors. But we found very little evidence of some kind of coordinated state-backed campaign. And the key events were things like there was the incident with a high-ranking member of the Chinese state posting, kind of inflammatory imagery around the war crimes of Australian and Afghanistan war crimes. So there was that image of the lamb and the Australian soldier. And look, our ministers took the bait, right? They engaged in that, inflamed that situation. But looking around those key incidents, that's exactly where you would expect to find those. If there was going to be an influence operation, they're the places you would go to try and use that as a catalyst to try and then build in and create these kinds of counterproductive discourses, inflaming that situation. And frankly, we just didn't see much of that at all. We saw people who were certainly kind of very much pro-China, but there was nothing to suggest through the patterns of their activities that was part of some, that there's 500 of them sitting in a room, all at keyboards, kind of smashing out those messages in unison. It's just not at that scale from the evidence we saw.
Can I ask then about that? There was just a couple of comments in the chat there about where some of this stuff starts. Obviously states are a key potential source because of their sheer power and resources. But do you think that this is a problem that may have also touched or is being perpetrated by things like private corporations? Like, I do wonder about this, something like climate change and how that debate is framed. You could see how there are vested interests from the fossil fuel sector that may wish to use these kinds of tactics. I mean, it's difficult to know where the tactic stops and where, the politics of everyday life begins, because this is a perennial issue that's marked lots of public policy making. But I wondered if you could offer some thoughts about where some of these disinfo campaigns start, whether it is just states or others.
Oh, look, yeah, there's huge research into this. I mean, tobacco is a big one, right? And they've been known to do this. They basically invented astroturfing and the playbook that a lot of these newer digital astroturfing campaigns are kind of adopting. There were cases recently in a lot of the anti-unionization stuff that's happening in the States. You're finding a lot of that activity, this information happening from the companies like your Walmarts or Amazons or others, where they're trying to pass themselves off as genuine workers and saying, we're really concerned about unionization. It's going to erode our, it's going to take money and not give us anything back, and trying to craft these messages and see if they can take hold. So there's absolutely evidence of this. And climate change, of course, is going to be there as well. There's huge money, right, in maintaining the status quo. And often, and I use this example in talking about the recent Ukraine conflict as well, often these disinformation campaigns don't even need to try to win over a side of an argument. It's often enough just to confuse and to stall any kind of progress. That, like, when you look at what's happening with Ukraine, I think a lot of the Russian propaganda and disinformation is possibly not even trying to win support for Russia. It's just trying to delay a coordinated response from the West, right, to come in and actually interrupt what's happening there. It's almost Putin trying to buy time, perhaps. And that's a lot of misinformation wrapped up there. It's often not to, convince you. It's often just to confuse the situation and make it appear as though there's not, say, a greater consensus for action and activity. So be that on climate change, be that on the case of like unionization of workers, anything like that. If they can maintain the status quo position, then that's almost a win for them at that point.
Hey, Josh, it strikes me that one of the challenges here is to move beyond thinking about the online disinformation as using these secret magic tools, but looking at it as a system that's rife for exploitation, but also rife for understanding. One of my reflections, I got a few calls about the Australia call to shut down Russia Today on social media, and it struck me that in the middle of a Black Swan event is probably not the right time to be thinking through the way your system's going to operate. It would be much better to do that when you're talking about whether or not there should be an enforceable code of disinformation leveled on the platforms outside the context of war. But interested in your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I think there's this reflexivity, I guess, when a big event like this happens for governments to act, and we saw it after the Christchurch massacre, where the government quickly implemented laws that require companies to take these sites down or block access to them, and that legislation had a whole bunch of issues with it, but it was passed very quickly, and they had to go back and fix it up later. So they really sort of need to sort of step back a bit when they're doing this sort of thing and think it through before they do that kind of thing. It's going to be interesting to watch what happens in the context of the upcoming federal election, because I don't think that my opinion is that like China thinks that Australia matters much more than we actually do. So that's why, you've got politicians who are like, well, China's going to be targeting us, et cetera, et cetera. There may be a little bit of that, and there's obviously money involved in some of these things, but I don't think that there'd be a concerted, disinformation campaign from China. I'd be very surprised if there was. I think it's probably going to come from more local sources. I think it was interesting. I was watching, there was the parliamentary committee hearing on Wednesday for the social media and online safety inquiry that they're doing at the moment. They had Facebook up again, or Meta up again, and Labor MP Tim Watts, who's the Shadow Assistant Communications Minister, was pushing Meta quite hard about how quickly they're going to respond in the context of a 4-week election campaign to fact checking or removing misinformation, disinformation from their platform. So they're quite concerned about a repeat of the 2019 election, where was that death tax stuff that kept getting circulated, and they're worried that Facebook in that instance, so they would remove posts that were not from politicians about it, or fact check it, sorry, but they kind of left the politicians ones up and people expressing opinion about whether Labor might introduce a death tax up, and they said that that's sort of their line. So they wouldn't really commit to how quickly they're going to turn it around, but I think there's going to be a lot of attention paid to how quickly they respond to these sorts of things, because we are going to see a lot of that. And particularly, you've got United Australia Party is going to be funding a lot of advertising in the lead up to the election, and the party says that the stuff that they're putting is not misinformation, disinformation, but I think there's going to be some of their ads will probably come under a lot of scrutiny as well. I think Craig Kelly was also in that committee hearing, and he was trying to get Facebook to commit to not fact-checking politicians during the election campaign, political candidates, which was very interesting. He made the comparison he essentially said it was amounted to foreign interference if Facebook intervened and fact checked one of his posts. So yeah, I think it's going to be an interesting time over the election campaign, I think.
Can I just jump in? Oh, sorry. You go ahead.
Sorry, Liz. I was just going to jump in off the back of you, Josh. So I think there is a point here, though, that how much we have deferred to private companies to essentially moderate and regulate our online public sphere. It's it shows a deficiency in at least having the conversation around how do we deal with this? Do we need truth in political advertising laws? These kinds of things. That I see a lot of pressure, and I'm kind of one of them, because let's be frank, the platforms provide very little transparency, and we kind of need that to keep them honest and know what's going on. But that's very different to have a conversation around observability and transparency and to jump to conversations around regulation. And I worry, like you bring up the current kind of debate around the online safety bills and these kinds of things. I think we're jumping the regulatory gun a little bit here before we've even been able to actually peer under the hood and see what is there. And what it's giving the platforms at the moment, I think, is it's giving them fuel for their fires to kind of push back and say, no, actually, here is the data here. And we saw that with the News Media Bargaining Code, that all this, hot air was out there around how much, revenue they're stealing from journalism and news. And they're able to turn around and say, well, no, actually, the data's here. It's not that significant in terms of our traffic. And so we're kind of letting them have too many of those aces up their sleeve if we don't force the transparency and observability aspect a little bit harder. And I think the first step in regulation should be around regulating in that kind of form of transparency and observability. And then we can get the evidence together of figuring out what do we do now, given what we know is happening on those platforms.
I was just going to say that this was sort of a question that I wanted to ask you in the last minutes of this, Daniel, because I was sort of wondering, to what extent do we think platforms do know this is a problem and do know what to do about it? The best information that I know of to date about how platforms tackle the problem of inauthentic content or activity or disinformation, it's called different things, but essentially, particularly during election times, is that memo that was written by a data analyst in Facebook who was very worried about this and said, I'm completely under-resourced. I'm having to make decisions, probably quite a young person living in San Francisco, making decisions about what content to take down, what to leave up in places, other parts of the world about which I don't have a huge amount of information. And to my mind, I wonder if we look under the hood and there's actually just not much there. Like, I think Facebook probably feels quite comfortable in some ways in relative terms doing this kind of work in somewhere like the United States or in somewhere like Australia. But I wonder whether they're really doing this in any meaningful way in lots of other parts of the world where they don't have a cultural context, where they don't have the capacity, whether it's linguistic or resources, to identify these kinds of networks. Like, your research, I think, just shows how challenging it is. I mean, they've got all the tools at their disposal, so I don't want to let them off the hook there, because I think absolutely this is their job. This is why they're so profitable, because they essentially allow the social costs of their platform to be offloaded onto all of us, and they privatize the gains. But I do wonder as well whether, I appreciate, transparency is the first step, but I don't even think they're the qualified people to be doing this work. This is a social political activity, and we need buy-in from people to do it, on a quite philosophical level. But I appreciate that the first step is transparency. But I did wonder, Daniel, whether you thought that they just aren't doing much of this, or anywhere near the amount that they maybe did, for example, at the last presidential election in the US, because they knew they were going to be scrutinized in that context.
And just double loading the question up, because we are running down and I want to get this out. But just to Lizzie's point, what are you guys doing to try to build some scrutiny into the Australian election? Because if we get to the end of the hour without talking about that, then I really haven't done my job at all.
Yeah, no, that's fine. I was going to wrap it in, but no, thank you for the prompt, Peter. So what we are doing to try and build a bit of transparency and kind of put the pressure back, because I completely agree with you, Lizzie, that we need to know what's going on. And I'll get to this point around, I agree with you. I think they're very under-equipped in terms of dealing with this themselves. So what we've built is this thing called the Australian Ad Observatory. It's under our large centre of excellence. I'm going to put a link in the chat for people. And what I would love for everyone today, if you can, is follow that link, and if you're comfortable, download the plugin. What this is going to do for us in the upcoming election is it's a small plugin, and when you open up Facebook, if you're a Facebook user, when you're scrolling through on Facebook on your computer, it detects any advertising that you encounter within your feed. It will then send that advertising, and only that advertising. We don't look at any other content. It's incredibly safe in terms of only grabbing the sponsored content. So we explain it on the page, sponsored, it has to be labeled as sponsored content. So we snip that out and we pull that up. What this gives us is the eyes on your end, right? Because Facebook has this transparency library that they like to, bring up at any inquiry. They say, yes, we're doing all this great stuff around transparency. But the fact, to Lizzie's point, is that, look, we got to trust them that they're labeling everything and that there's no malicious actors there, which of course there are, right? And there's that great example from last week with, I think it was Reset, who bought some ads, political ads, didn't put the political issues category in the ad, and we're still able to get them authorized by Facebook. So we know that Facebook systems are fallible. So what this plugin then does is it means that we can collect those ads that you see in a massive database and start to actually sift through that and figure out, are there political advertising in there that is not being correctly accounted for by Facebook through their own transparency initiative? And then that gives us a way to kind of meet in the middle and say, look, well, that's all great to kind of have all this, nice PR exercise around transparency. On the ground, we know it's a very different story, and you're obviously not doing enough to be able to pick up this material. But to get to more substantive your point, Lizzie, that I agree that these are gnarly problems, and the problem with the platforms has been they're very much the closed shop, and I think almost a bit of hubris there, that they see themselves as knowing more and being better at this than anybody else, and not really letting the academic community in, who've got significant, I think, significantly more advanced understandings of some of these issues and could really help them if they would allow themselves to be so helped. Part of it, I think, is a bit of political fear, right? They fear that when an academic looks at this, or we kind of examine the problem, that presents it as, oh, there's a problem here. And it's kind of like they want to make it seem as though they have all the answers, their systems are infallible, of course there's nothing going wrong there, and they've got all these smart engineers working at it, and they're the best place to do anything about it. And it's almost like they're refusing to admit that there is a problem there, and in fact they do need others to help them out and to help them with these problems. And look, the problems are hard. Like, one example of this, right, I'll just leave people with, is think about mimetic communication. So images and text. A simple piece of text can completely change the context of an image. So you can take an image by itself and it appears pretty benign. So say take a graveyard, right? So a picture of a graveyard by itself, okay, it's a graveyard, fine. Depending on the text you put with that, can completely change its meaning. So, put text, and this is an example that Facebook themselves use, is all of your people belong here, right? Take that text with that image, and that's quite a sinister message, right? That's hate speech. That's a really difficult thing for a computer system to identify and classify in that way. And that's the problem they're dealing with, is that human communication is complex, right? Is multi-layered. And those platforms, their moderation, they never admit it, but or make this public too much, is there's a huge amount of human labor involved in that. They make it seem as though there's these fancy algorithms going through and detecting and siphoning through and picking out the content. But in fact, there's armies of humans that are there assessing these according to set guidelines. And so, they're still relying on human judgment. And while they're doing that, these systems just can't scale. And so it means that material, that objectionable material, is sitting there and propagating on the platform unchecked. So look, yeah, I agree. I think there needs to be a lot more done, but I'm firm in my view that I think a key to it is them actually opening themselves up to assistance, to a bit more of that transparency. Because look, ultimately the tools can do amazing things, right? They can allow us to connect and share information, but they've got significant problems, I think, that we need to help them with.
Well, I think you've nailed it. Once they open the kimono, you realise that it's not viable, and those systems can't scale and be safe. And that's the problem. Hey, just winding down, Lizzie, anything in the digital rights watch calendar for the next couple of weeks that people need to be aware of?
Well, it just did happen yesterday, so I'm going to take liberty there. But we just released a State of Digital Rights report, and I would encourage everyone to have a look and read it. It's available on our website. I'll quickly find a link while I'm here. But it's, just reflections on the last 12 months of key topics, but they're really accessible, interesting essays from a diverse range of thinkers and activists and workers in the tech industry. So I would encourage everyone to take a look if they're interested.
Terrific. What are you looking at for over the next fortnight, Josh?
That's a good question. I think I've been diving into a bit of the UAP candidates because a lot of them had quite an interesting digital trail, but like a lot of them have been quite private. I might just end on sort of circling back to the social media companies. Like I think there's probably twofold problem here that it will play out in the next couple of months. The first is that the tech companies always say that they want to be regulated, but then when legislation is actually presented to them, they're very much anti anything being done. So that's the other thing. From the government point of view, I think there's a real reluctance to actually do anything here. We've got this voluntary disinformation code, but the government doesn't really seem keen to want to do anything more with it. I think because that would play, it would tie their hand behind their back in a way, because they would find this code also being applied to themselves, which I think they don't want. And it's a similar, like someone in their messages was saying that the government hasn't done anything about the spam text messages. They could change the Privacy Act tomorrow to prevent political parties from being exempt from that, and that would stop it completely, but they don't want to because it would apply to them as well.
Yeah. I think that truth in political advertising is a debate that won't be resolved before this election, but I'm sure with Dan's help and your help, Josh, and probably our work on the sideline, Lizzie will be making the case for something a little bit more robust next time we go round. Guys, thanks for your time today. Great having you, Josh. Dan, terrific. Thanks for being part of the discussion. We'll see you in a fortnight, Lizzie, and thanks everyone for joining Burning Platforms.
You've been listening to Burning Platforms, a fortnightly podcast from the Australia Institute's Centre for Responsible Technology. It was recorded live in a virtual town hall. If you'd like to attend one of these discussions in real life, you can register at centreforresponsibletechnology.org.au, where you can also subscribe to our Tech Check summary of the latest news and ideas. Burning Platforms was produced on Gadigal land by Jennifer Macy. Talk again in a fortnight.